This video, I'm going to be modifying my fabrication setup to help me fabricate these two squares more efficiently and more accurately. I'm going to be drilling a hole in the middle of my table to be able to insert one of these F-clamps to be able to reach this fourth corner on the square fabrication. And then I'm going to add some threaded tabs to the outside of my table corners to be able to slide these pieces up to it to get a nice 90 off of my table. So I started off finding the center of the table to drill or cut this hole. I really didn't want it to look janky, and the center was going to look the best since I'm only putting one hole. I'm using the tape roll here to draw a circle. It ended up being a little bit big, so I found this weight plate, which with the offset from the plasma head actually worked out perfectly for the right size circle for that F-clamp to fit in there nicely. So I went ahead and drilled a hole really just to help the plasma cutter be able to pierce all the way through this 1/2-inch table. Otherwise, a lot of sparks were really going to shoot up and hit me in the face and get all over my arms and my legs. So I drilled that hole and I got to using the plasma cutter here. I made sure to really go slow as I was trying to cut to, one, get a good, nice, clean cut, and two, avoid sparks being blown back into my face like that. I ended up melding the end of my offset tool there, so I had to take it off and freehand. I put some PPE on just to help cover my arms and my feet, and then I finished out cutting this hole. Now, even with trying to make it a nice cut, that plug was having trouble coming out of there with the kerf, so I used a punch and a hammer to beat it out. I went ahead and got that weight plate and the plasma cutter back out and re-ran around the edge just to clean up the cut with that plasma head. Me being an idiot, forgot to swing my stool out away from underneath and it got all burnt up. But that's a pretty good hole and I think it's gonna work. I'm still gonna clean it up with a burr grinder, and I'm gonna get the dross off the bottom here with a chisel and a hammer. It took a little bit and there was quite a bit of buildup with that 1/2-inch plate, but I got it all off, hit it with the angle grinder, and I was good to go. I got this Hercules burr grinder with a double cut burr in the end there. I use this to clean that edge up just to try to make it look as professional as possible. Functionally, it's not going to add anything, but it is going to look nice when I'm done here. That looks like a pretty good hole if I do say so myself. Ding! So I'm going to throw that F-clamp inside that hole just to make sure it works functionally how I kind of want it to. It slides down, rotates in there. I think it's going to work great. Let's move on to welding those nuts on the side of the table for those tabs. I'm using this 3/8 bolt with a nut. I'm going to throw it on the side of the table here and use the nut just to make sure that it's perpendicular to the edge of this table. I think it's going to work nicely with those tabs. Now, since we're trying to set this up to help out with the Fireball Tool Challenge, I made sure that both my tabs were going to land within that 20-inch mark. So this is how I have it set up. I have my vice grip holding that nut down to the edge of my plate. So I went through and tacked up all of these nuts with those bolts on it around the corners, all 4 of these to hold those tabs. Now I did figure out if you leave the bolt inside the nut during the tacking process, that helps out with being able to thread that nut back on. I left the nut on 3 of them, but one of them I didn't, and I can't get the bolt back into it. So we're gonna have to cut that off and re-tack it on, making sure to leave the bolt in the threaded nut during the tacking process. I still had my welding helmet on grind mode here. Whoops. And I was able to back that bolt in and out. And so I thought we were good to go. However, this bolt was really difficult to get out. And so I ended up breaking the bolt, trying to remove it. I think these nuts are just a little bit too small with the amount of heat input required with that 1/2-inch plate to really not deform them to where it's difficult. So we're going to cut this off and only tack it on one side of the nut, and then we should be good to go. So to do all this tacking, I'm using my Mig Max 215. It's really been a good welder thus far, and I enjoy using it on the 240 volts with the manual settings. Seems to weld just how I like it. So now that we got them tacked on, we're gonna make a tab here. I need to drill out a hole so that bolt will fit through it. And I'm using this 17 gauge material. The stepper bit I found is a really good way to put a hole in sheet metal. Just works a little bit quicker and cuts a nice hole. So I mounted that tab up just to see how it was gonna work with that 2-inch square tube. I actually like the tab for the stop being a thin 17 gauge material. It allows for me to hit it with a hammer to kind of bend it a little bit further past that edge to fine tune my squareness. So I think that's going to work out good. I'm going to make 3 more of these. So I always make sure to use the very first part that I cut to measure the lines whenever I'm making multiple parts. If you don't do that, your error will compound part to part, and your last part will not look anything like your first part. And I cleaned it up on my belt sander here, just to keep everything clean and try to avoid getting cut while I'm working with all this. Again, I'm using that stepper bit, which works nicely, and I already have those punched out. So I drill these 3 out real quick, make them all fitted up nice and tight with that bolt that we're gonna be using. I went ahead and put them on the table. I did have to go through and hit each of these nuts with an angle grinder just to flush it up with the edge of the table so that tab was going to sit nearly straight vertically. You can see it looks pretty nice with those tabs flipped up, and I think that's going to serve its purpose and function well. We'll see once we actually test it out though. I had to make sure it was square because my table wasn't perfect, and so I went through and thought it would be best to use the 2-inch squares I'm going to be using in the Fireball Tool Challenge. So you can see this edge looks nice, but on this vertical edge, it is a little bit off at the very end. So I'm going to go ahead and use my hammer using that 17 gauge material and hit that tab in a little bit just to square it up to where you can push the 2-inch tube flush against those tabs and it will give you a square weldment. Took a couple rounds to get it fine-tuned, had to tap it a few times, but at the end of the day we got it to where it was square every time you pushed it up against the fence. So since I have these tabs sticking up ready to be used, I decided to test out how quickly I could achieve square on a weldment. It seems to go pretty well. I get the square and then I get the first corner clamped down and the subsequent clamps clamped down on the corners. I'm using the 3-2-1 blocks because they kind of span across both sides of the 2-inch tube and it works well. I am having to use that 2-inch tube there just to bridge the gap because that hole at the center did not allow for that F-clamp to reach all the way to the corner. Just requires a couple more pieces of equipment there to be set up, but it's just a nuisance, but it works quite well. I did have to do some finesse work with the hammer to get the dimensions and squareness all in place here, but really it went by pretty quick. I think this setup's really gonna work out well. Checking squareness here, everything was good. All my clamps looking good at all these corners, and I'm really liking this setup. I think the Fireball Tool Challenge is gonna be feasible with this setup, but only time will tell. In the next video, I'm gonna give it my second attempt, and we'll see if I can beat Fireball Tool Challenge in 30 minutes.